The Downfall of Numenor. It is said by the Eldar that men came into the world in the time of the shadow of Morgoth, and they fell swiftly under his dominion. For he sent his emissaries among them, and they listened to his evil and cunning words, and they worshipped the darkness, and yet feared it. But there were some that turned from evil, and left the lands of their kindred, and wandered ever westward. For they had heard a rumor that in the west there was a light which the shadow could not dim. The servants of Morgoth pursued them with hatred, and their ways were long and hard. Yet they came at last to the lands that look upon the sea. They entered Beleriand in the days of the War of the Jewels. The Edain these were named in the Sindarin tongue, and they became friends and allies of the Eldar, and did deeds of great valor in the war against Morgoth. In the great battle, when at last Morgoth was overthrown, and Thangoridurim was broken, the Edain, alone of the kindreds of men, fought for the Valar, whereas many others fought for Morgoth. And after the victory of the lords of the west, those of the evil men who were not destroyed fled back into the east, where many of their race were still wandering in the unharvested lands, wild and lawless, refusing alike the summons of the Valar and of Morgoth. And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings. Then the Valar forsook for a time the men of Middle-earth, who had refused their summons, and had taken the friends of Morgoth to be their masters. And men dwelt in darkness, and were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion, demons, and dragons, and misshapen beasts, and the unclean orcs that are mockeries of the children of Iluvatar. And the lot of men was unhappy. To the fathers of men of the three faithful houses rich reward was also given. Eanwe came among them and taught them, and they were given wisdom and power and life, more enduring than any others of mortal race have possessed. A land was made for the Edain to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor, for it was sundered from either by a wide sea. Yet it was nearer to Valinor, the land of gift, and the star of Earendil shone bright in the west, as a token that all was made ready, and as a guide over the sea. And men marveled to see that silver flame in the paths of the sun. Then the Edain set sail upon the deep waters, following the star, and the Valar laid a peace upon the sea for many days, and set sunlight and a sailing wind, so that the waters glittered before the eyes of the Edain like rippling glass, and the foam flew like snow before the stems of their ships. But so bright was Rothinsil that even at morning men could see it glimmering in the west, and in the cloudless night it shone alone, for no other star could stand beside it. And setting their course towards it, the Edain came at last over leagues of sea, and saw far the land that was prepared for them, Andor, the land of gift, shimmering in a golden haze. Then they went up out of the sea, and found a country fair and fruitful, and they were glad. And they called that land Elena, which is starwards, but also Andunie, which is westerness, Numenor, in the High Eldarian tongue. This was the beginning of that people that in the grey elven speech are called the Dunedain, the Numenorians, kings among men. But they did not thus escape from the doom of death that Iluvatar had set upon all mankind. And there were mortals still, through their years were long, and they knew no sickness, ere the shadow fell upon them. Therefore they grew wise and glorious, and in all things more like to the firstborn than any other of the kindreds of men. And they were tall, taller than the tallest of the sons of Middle Earth, and the light of their eyes was like the bright stars. Of the old chief city and haven of Numenor was in the midst of its western coasts, and it was called Andunie, because it faced the sunset. But in the midst of the land was a mountain, tall and steep, and it was named the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven. And upon it was a high place that was hallowed to Eru Iluvatar, and it was open and unroofed. No other temple or fane was there in the land of the Numenorians. At the feet of the mountain were built the tombs of the kings, and hard by upon a hill was Armenelos, fairest of the cities, and there stood the tower of the citadel that was raised by Elros, the son of Arundel, whom the Valar appointed to be the first king of the Dunedain. Above all arts they nourished shipbuilding and seacraft, and they became mariners whose like shall never be again, since the world was diminished, and voyaging upon the wide seas was the chief feat and adventure of their hardy men in the gallant days of their youth. But the lords of Valinor forbade them to sail so far westward that the coasts of Numenor could no longer be seen. For long the Dunedain were content, though they did not fully understand the purpose of this ban. The design of Manwë was that the Numenorians should not be tempted to seek for the blessed realm, nor desire to overpass the limits set to their bliss, becoming enamored of the immorality of the Valar and the Eldar and the lands where all things endure. Thus it was that, because of the ban of the Valar, the voyages of the Dunedain in those days went ever eastward and not westward, from the darkness of the north to the heats of the south, and beyond the south to the nether darkness. And they came even into the inner seas, and sailed about Middle Earth, and glimpsed from their high prows the gates of the morning in the east. And the Dunedain came at times to the shores of the great lands, and they took pity on the forsaken world of Middle Earth. And the lords of Numenor set foot again upon the western shores in the dark years of men, and none yet dared to withstand them. The Numenorians dwelt never long in Middle Earth, nor made there as yet any habitation of their own. Eastward they must sail, but ever west their hearts returned. Now this yearning grew ever greater with the years, and the Numenorians began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life, to escape from death, and the ending of delight grew strong upon them. And ever as their power and glory grew greater, their unquiet increased. For though the Valar had rewarded the Dunedain with long life, they could not take from them the weariness of the world that comes at last. And they died, even their kings of the seed of Arundel, and the span of their lives was brief in the eyes of the Eldar. Thus it was that a shadow fell upon them, in which maybe the will of Morgoth was at work, that still moved in the world. And the Numenorians began to murmur, at first in their hearts, and then in open words, against the doom of men, and most of all against the ban which forbade them to sail into the west. And they said among themselves, why do the lords of the west sit there in peace unending, while we must die and go we know not whither, leaving our home and all that we have made? Why should we not go to Avalone and greet there our friends?" The Eldar reported these words to the Valar, and Manwë was grieved, seeing a cloud gather on the noontide of Numenor. In this age, as is elsewhere told, Sauron arose again in Middle-earth, and grew, and turned back to the evil in which he was nurtured by Morgoth, becoming mighty in his service. Sauron hated the Númenóreans because of the deeds of their fathers, and their ancient alliance with the elves, and allegiance to the Valar. Now he learned that the kings of Numenor had increased in power and splendor, and he hated them the more, and he feared them, lest they should invade his lands and wrest from him the dominion of the East. But for a long time he did not dare to challenge the lords of the sea, and he withdrew from the coasts when the strength of his terror and mastery over men had grown exceedingly great. He began to assail the strong places of the Númenóreans upon the shores of the sea.
The shadow grew deeper upon Numenor. The white tree was untended, and began to decline. In time, the 24th king acceded to the scepter, calling himself Tar Palantir, and he went once more in due seasons to the hallows of Eru upon Men Eltarma. The white tree he attended again with great honor, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of kings come to its end. But his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar with the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. Thus the latter days of Tar Palantir became darkened with grief, and it came to pass that he grew weary of grief and died. He had no son, but a daughter only, whom he named Miriel in the Elven tongue, and to her, now, by rights and laws of the Númenóreans, came the scepter. But her cousin, Pharazôn, took her to wife, against her will, doing evil in this, and evil also in the laws of Numenor did not prevent the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. When they were wedded, he seized the scepter into his own hand, taking the title of Ar-Pharazôn, and the name of his queen he changed to Ar-Zimrafil. The mightiest and proudest was Ar-Pharazôn the Golden of all of those who wielded the scepter of the Sea Kings since the foundation of Numenor, and 24 kings and queens had ruled the Númenóreans before, and now slept in their deep tombs under the mount of the Men Eltarma, lying upon beds of gold. And sitting upon his carven throne, in the city of Armenlos, in the glory of his power, he brooded darkly, thinking of war. For he had learned in Middle-earth the strength of the realm of Sauron, and his hatred of Westerness. And now there came to him the masters of ships and captains returning out of the east, and they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might, and he had taken now the title of King of Men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenóreans into the sea, and destroy even Numenor, if that might be. Great was the anger of Ar-Pharazôn at these tidings, and he determined, without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of King of Men he should himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant. For in his pride he deemed that no king should ever rise so mighty as to vie with the heirs of Arendil. Therefore he began in that time to smithy great hoards of weapons, and many ships of war he built, and stored them with his arms. And when all was made ready, he himself set sail with his hosts into the east. But the fleet came at last to that place that was called Umbar, where was the mighty haven of the Númenóreans, that no hand had wrought. Empty and silent were all the lands about when the kings of the sea marched upon Middle-earth. For 7 days he journeyed without banner and trumpet, and he came to a hill. He went up, and he sat there, his pavilions and his throne, and he sat him down in the midst of the land, and of the tents of his host were arranged around him, blue and golden and white, as a field of tall flowers. Then he sent forth heralds, and he commanded Sauron to come before him, and to swear fealty. And Sauron came, even from his mighty tower at Barad-dûr he came, and made no offer of battle, for he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumors of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them, and he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dunedain. And he was crafty, well skilled to gain what he would by subtlety, when force would not avail. Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn and soothed his tongue, and men wondered, for all that he said seemed fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that for the better keeping of Sauron, and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Middle-earth, there to dwell as a hostage for him and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desires. And Sauron passed over the sea, and looked upon the land of Numenor, and on the city of Armenelos, in the days of its glory, and he was astounded, but his heart was filled with more envy and hate. Yet such was the cunning of his mouth and mind, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he became closest to the secret counsels of the king. For flattery, sweet as honey, was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men. And seeing the favour that he had of their lord, all the counsellors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amendil, lord of Andunier. Then, slowly, a change came over the lands, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear. And although those who remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. For now, having the ears of men, Sauron made with many arguments gainsaid all that the Valar had taught, and he bade men think that in the world, in the east and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for their winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at last come to the ends of those lands and seas, beyond all lay the ancient darkness, and out of it the world was made. For darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And Ar-Pharazôn said, Who is the Lord of the darkness? Then behind locked doors Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied, saying, It is he whose name is now not spoken, for the Valar have deceived you, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are an oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But that he is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom. His name is Melkor, lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor, the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly, and in the face of his people. And they for the most part followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amendil, counsellor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion, then young men by the reckoning of Numenor. Amendil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros Tar-Miniatur, although not of the ruling house to which belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armenelos. In the days of their youth together, Amendil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was one of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Numenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honor by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amendil withdrew to Romena, where all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret, for he feared that evil would now grow apace, and all elf friends were in peril. And soon it came to pass, for the Meneltarma was utterly deserted in those days, and though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king would let no man, upon the pain of death, ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept Iluvatar in their hearts. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the Fair, that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and the light of Valinor. And at first the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree, as was forspoken by Tar-Palantir. Thus, in his folly, he who now hated the Eldar and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Numenor. But when Amendil heard rumor of the evil purpose of Sauron, He was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron would surely have his will. Then he spoke to Elendil and to the sons of Elendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Valinor. And Isildur said no word, but went out by night and did a deed for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in disguise to Arminelos and to the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful. And he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron. And the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At that time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, and its winter was nigh. Isildur passed through the guards, and took from the tree a fruit that hung upon it, and turned to go. But the guard was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds. And he escaped, and because he was disguised, it was not discovered who had laid hands upon the tree. But Isildur came at last, hardly back to Ramenna, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amendil, ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amendil, and a shoot arose from it, and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaves opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose, and was troubled no more by his wounds.
None too soon was this done, for after the assault the king yielded to Sauron, and felled the White Tree, and turned them wholly away from the allegiance of his fathers. But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill, in the midst of the city of the Numenorians, Armenelos the Golden, a mighty temple. And it was in the form of a circle at the base, and there the walls were 50 feet in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across the center, and the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome. And that dome was roofed all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen afar off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black, for there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a louver, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, and it crackled and was consumed. But men marveled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased. And in that temple, with the spilling of blood, and torment, and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release them. And most often, from among the faithful, there chose their victims, yet never openly, on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather was the cause sought against them, that they hated the king, and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges were for the most part false. Yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. But for all this, death did not depart from the land. Rather it came sooner, and more often, and in many dreadful guises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and had laid them down in the end to sleep, when they were weary at last of the world, now madness and sickness assailed them, and yet they were afraid to die and go out into the dark, the realm of the Lord that they had taken. And they cursed themselves in their agony. And men took weapons in those days, and slew one another for little cause, for they were become quick to anger. And Sauron, or those whom he had bound to himself, went about the land, setting man against man, so that the people murmured against the king and the lords, or against any that had aught that they had not, and the men of power took cruel revenge. Nonetheless, for long it seemed to the Numenorians that they prospered, and if they were not increased in happiness, yet they grew more strong, and their rich men ever richer. For with the aid and counsel of Sauron, they multiplied their possessions, and they devised engines, and they built ever greater ships. And they sailed now with power and armory to Middle-earth, and they came no longer as bringers of gifts, nor even as rulers, but as fierce men of war. And they hunted the men of Middle-earth, and took their goods, and enslaved them. And many they slew cruelly upon their altars. For they built in their fortresses temples and great tombs in those days. And men feared them. And the memory of the kindly kings of the ancient days faded from the world, and was darkened by many a tale of dread. Thus our Pharazôn, king of the land of the star, grew to the mightiest tyrant that had yet been in the world since the reign of Morgoth, though in truth Sauron ruled all from behind the throne. But the years passed, and the king felt the shadow of death approach, as his days lengthened, and he was filled with fear and wrath. Now came the hour that Sauron had prepared and long had awaited, and Sauron spoke to the king, saying that his strength was now so great that he might think to have his will in all things, and be subject to no command or ban. And he said, the Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it, hiding it as best they may, because of their avarice, and their fear lest the king of men should wrest from them the deathless realm, and rule the world in their stead. And though, doubtless, the gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage, yet against all justice is it done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, our Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due. Then our Pharazôn, being besotted, and walking under the shadow of death, for his span was drawing towards its end, hearkened unto Sauron. And he began to ponder in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar. He was long preparing this design, and he spoke not openly of it, yet it could not be hidden from all. And Amandil, becoming aware of the purposes of the king, was dismayed and filled with a great dread, for he knew that men could not vanquish the Valar in war, and that ruin must come upon the world if this war were not stayed. Therefore he called his son Elendil, and he said to him, the days are dark, and there is no hope for men, for the faithful are few. Therefore I am minded to try that counsel which our forefather Eärendil took, to sail into the west, be there ban or no, and to speak to the Valar, even to Manwë himself, if may be, and beseech his aid ere all is lost. Would you then betray the king? Said Elendil, for you know well the charge that they make against us, that we are traitors and spies, and that until this day it has been false. If I thought that Manwë needed such a messenger, said Amandil, I would betray the king, for there is but one loyalty from which no man can be absolved in his heart for any cause, but it is for mercy upon men, and their deliverance from Sauron the deceiver, that I would plead, since some at least have remained faithful. And as for the ban, I will suffer in myself the penalty, lest all my people should become guilty. But what think you, my father, is likely to befall those of your house whom you leave behind, when your deed becomes known? It must not become known, said Amandil. I will prepare my going in secret, and I will set sail into the east, whither daily the ships depart from our havens, and thereafter, as wind and chance may allow, I will go about, through south or north, back into the west, and seek what I may find. But for you and your folk, my son, I counsel that you should prepare yourselves other ships, and put aboard all such things as your hearts cannot bear to part with. And when the ships are ready, you should lie in the haven of Rumina, and give out among men that you purpose, when you see your time, to follow me into the east. Amandil is no longer so dear to our kinsman upon the throne that he will grieve over much, if we seek to depart for a season or for good. But let it not be seen that you intend to take many men, or he will be troubled, because of the war that he now plots, for which he will need all the force that he may gather. Seek out the faithful that are known still to be true, and let them join you in secret, if they are willing to go with you, and share in your design. And what shall that design be? Said Elendil. To meddle not in the war, and to watch, answered Amandil. Until I return, I can say no more, but it is most like that you should fly from the land of the star, with no star to guide you. For that land is defiled. Then you shall lose all that you have loved, foretasting death in life, seeking a land of exile elsewhere. But east or west, the Valar alone can say. Then Amandil said farewell to all his household, as one that is about to die. For, said he, it may well prove that you will see me never again, and that I shall show you no such sign as Eärendil showed long ago. But hold you ever in readiness, for the end of the world that we have known is now at hand. It is said that Amandil set sail in a small ship at night, and steered first eastward, and then went about and passed into the west. And he took with him 3 servants, dear to his heart, and never again were they heard of by word or sign in this world. Nor is there any tale or guess of their fate. Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Numenor there was no easy absolving. But Elendil did all that his father had bidden, and his ships lay off the east coast of the land. And the faithful put aboard their wives and their children, and their heirlooms, and great store of goods. Many things there were of beauty and power, such as the Numenorians had contrived in the days of their wisdom. Vessels and jewels, and scrolls of lore written in scarlet and black. And the 7 stones they had, the gift of the Eldar. But in the ship of Isildur was guarded the young tree, the scion of Nimloth the Fair. Thus Elendil held himself in readiness, and did not meddle in the evil deeds of those days. And ever he looked for a sign that did not come. Then he journeyed in secret to the western shores, and gazed out over the sea, for sorrow and yearning were upon him, and he greatly loved his father. But naught could he descry, save the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn gathering in the havens of the west.
Now, aforetime, in the Isle of Numenor, the weather was ever apt to the needs and liking of men, rain and dew seasons, and ever in measure, and sunshine, now warmer, now cooler, and winds from the sea. And when the wind was in the west, it seemed to many that it was filled with a fragrance, fleeting but sweet, heart-stirring, as of flowers that bloom ever in undying meads, and have no names on mortal shores. But all this was now changed, for the sky itself was darkened, and there were storms of rain and hail in those days, and violent winds, and ever and anon a great ship of the Numenorians would flounder, and return not to haven, though such a grief had not until then befallen them since the rising of the star. And out of the west there came at times a great cloud in the evening, shaped as if it were an eagle, with pinions spread to the north and to the south, and slowly it would loom up, blotting out the sunset. Then uttermost night would fall upon Numenor, and some of the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings, and thunder echoed between sea and cloud. Then men grew afraid. "Behold, the eagles of the lords of the west!" they cried. "The eagles of Manwë have come upon Numenor!" And they fell upon their faces. Then some few would repent for a season, but others hardened their hearts, and they shook their fists at heaven, saying, "The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first, The next blow shall be ours." These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightning increased, and slew men upon the hills, and in the fields, and in the streets of the city, and a fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple, and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken. And Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle, and defied the lightning, and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god, and did all that he would. When, therefore, the last portent came, they heeded it little, for the land shook under them, and a groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the seas, and smoke issued from the peak of the Meneltarma. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armaments. In that time the fleets of the Númenóreans darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were gold and black. And all things waited upon the word of Ar-Pharazôn, and Sauron withdrew into the innermost circle of the temple, and men brought him more victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came out of the dayfall, and were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line to the end of which diminished beyond sight. And they came with their wings spread ever wider, grasping the sky. But the west burned red behind them, and they glowed beneath, as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all Númenor was illuminated as with a smothering fire. And men looked upon the faces of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath. Then Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart, and he went aboard his mighty ship, Alcarondes, Castle of the Sea. Many oared it was, and many masted, golden and sable, and upon it the throne of Ar-Pharazôn was set. Then he did on his panoply and his crown, and let raise his standard, and he gave the signal for the raising of the anchors. And in that hour the trumpets of Númenor outrang the thunder. Thus the fleets of the Númenóreans moved against the menace of the west, and there was little wind, but they had many oars, and many strong slaves to row beneath the lash. The sun went down, and there came a great silence. Darkness fell upon the land, and the sea was still, while the world waited for what should betide. Slowly the fleets passed out of the sight of the watchers in the havens, and their lights faded, and night took them, and in the morning they were gone. For a wind arose in the east, and it wafted them away, and they broke the band of the Valar, and sailed into forbidden seas, going up with war against the deathless, to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came out of the deeps of the sea, and encompassed Alvalane, and the isles of Eressëa, and the Eldar mourned, for in the light of the setting sun was cut off by the clouds of the Númenóreans. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the blessed realm, and the coasts of Valinor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered in the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores, and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. The pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if no one should do battle for it. And a host of the Númenóreans encamped in might upon Tuna, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world. And a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and the smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken, and all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king, and the mortal warriors who had set foot upon the land of Aman, were buried under falling hills. There it is said they lie imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten, until the last battle, and the day of doom. But the land of Aman and Eressëa of the Eldar was taken away, and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Andor, the land of gift, Numenor of the kings, Elena of the Star of Erendil, was utterly destroyed. For it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Ilúvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished. For Valinor and Erasea were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. And in an hour unlooked for by men, this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then, suddenly, fire burst from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Numenor went down into the sea, with all its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore. They vanished forever. And at last, of all the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tarmiriel the queen, fairer than any silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waves overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. But whether or not it were that Amandil came indeed to the Valar, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer, by the grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Ravenna, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple. He went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on the time. There he was protected by the land from the great draught of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when the devouring wave rolled over the land, and Numenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed, and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and the agony of that day. But the great wind took him, wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships away, and it rent their sails, and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water.
9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2. And they fled before the black gale out of the twilight of doom into the darkness of the world. And the deeps rose beneath them in towering anger, and waves like unto mountains, moving with great caps of writhen snow, bore them up amid the wreckage of the clouds, and after many days cast them away upon the shores of Middle-earth. And all the coasts and seaward regions of the western world suffered great change and ruin in that time, for the seas invaded the lands, and shores foundered, and ancient isles were drowned, and new isles were uplifted, and hills crumbled, and rivers were turned into strange courses. Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenóreans and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle, and again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm, and a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever. He was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep, and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure. But these things come not into the tale of the drowning of Numenor, of which now all is told, and even the name of that land perished, and men spoke thereafter not of Elena, nor of Andor the gift that was taken away, nor of Numenor, or the confines of the world, but the exiles on the shores of the sea, if they turned towards the west, the desire of their hearts, spoke of Mar Nufalmar, that was whelmed in the waves, Akalabeth, the downfallen, Atalante in the Eldarin. Thus in after days, what by the voyages of ships, what by lore and starcraft, the kings of men knew that the world was indeed made round, and yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart, and to come to the ancient west, and to Avalone, if they would. Therefore the lore masters of men said that a straight road must still be, for those that were permitted to find it, and they taught that, while the new world fell away, the old road and the path of the memory of the west still went on, as it were a mighty bridge, invisible, that passed through the air of breath and of flight, which were bent now as the world was bent, and traversed Ilmen, which flesh unaided cannot endure, until it came to tall Eressëa, the lonely isle, and maybe even beyond, to Valinor, where the Valar still dwell and watch the unfolding of the story of the world, and tales and rumors arose along the shores of the sea, concerning mariners and men forlorn upon the water whom, by some fate of grace or favor of the Valar, had entered in upon the straight way, and have seen the face of the world sink below them, and so had come to the lamplit quays of Avalone, or verily to the last beaches on the margin of Aman, and there had looked upon the white mountain, dreadful and beautiful, before they died.
Happy Tolkien Reading Day.